Avengers Infinity War and Avengers Endgame. These are two of the most anticipated movies of all time and arguably two of the best films in the entire Marvel Cinematic Universe. But which of the two is superior? We are about to find out. Let the battle commence. The story for Infinity War continues directly from Thor Ragnarok. Thanos is on a personal mission to obtain the Infinity Stone so he can wipe out half the existence of all life in the universe with a snap of his fingers. Our heroes try to stop him, but despite their best efforts, Thanos acquires all the stones and snaps his fingers, killing off half the universe's population. Our heroes end in ruin as Thanos stares at the sunset knowing that he is the victor of the Infinity War. And the story for Endgame continues directly after the events of Infinity War. The film opens exactly as I thought it would, by showing us Hawkeye's perspective of the Thanos snap where he loses his family. We then flash forward to the rest of our surviving characters, and they pay a visit to Thanos and realize that he has destroyed the Infinity Stone so they can't reverse what he did. Thor kills Thanos by cutting off his head, and we are then taken 5 years later where our characters try to move on and live their lives. Meanwhile, we find that Ant-Man gets rescued by a rat, and he tells the Avengers that by using the Quantum Realm, they can in fact use time travel as a means to go back in time and acquire all the Infinity Stones and use them to bring the Fallen back. From here, our remaining heroes go on a time heist to retrieve the stones throughout their past movies so they can repair the damage done by Thanos. Now, I am aggressively paraphrasing the story for Endgame here, because if I talk about all the plot threads in this film, then I will be describing the entire 3-hour movie, so I will mainly describe what I liked and disliked about the story for Endgame. Now, the first thing I downright loved about the story for Endgame is the tone. The first hour of the movie is like a drama, albeit with fully established superheroes. The only other time I've seen this type of drama where our remaining superheroes are dealing with loss is in Logan. What Logan has, though, that Avengers Endgame doesn't, is a consistent tone. Now, as much as I really liked what Avengers Endgame was doing with the drama, it did mix in a lot of unnecessary comedy that didn't fit given the very dark and dour times our heroes are in. Infinity War, on the other hand, didn't have this problem, and not only was Infinity War one of the darkest movies in the MCU, but whenever it told its jokes, I can't think of a single one that didn't work, and everything the movie wanted to relay in its story all made sense. Now, as much as I liked a lot of the story elements in Endgame, there is a ton of stuff that doesn't make sense, or at the very least, goes against mainstream sci-fi logic. The most obvious one being time travel. Now, the first time I saw this movie, I thought that the alterations it made to time travel was just downright stupid. But after I watched the movie the second time, I paid extra attention to the conversation Banner has with the Ancient One, and that really did clear some stuff up for me. So although I have made peace with this new form of time travel, you can still easily pick holes with it. And if anyone came up to me and said that they didn't like the way Endgame handled time travel, then I totally understand, because a lot of it was convenience. And speaking of convenience, there is a ton of stuff that you don't realize when watching the movie, but when you reflect on it, you start to realize that there are a lot of other things besides the time traveling that doesn't make sense. One of the biggest ones is Stark's version of the Infinity Gauntlet. Now, in Infinity War, Thanos had to go to the heart of a neutron star in order to forge something that could withstand and contain the power of the Infinity Stones, the very same place that Thor's hammer was forged. But apparently, he never had to go that far because, as it turns out, Stark's metal armor could hold the stones all along. Now, the scenes themselves when Banner and Stark snap their fingers are so awesome that you don't even think about the logistics of it, so I can kind of let it go, but it is something that is on my mind, and I can't erase it from my head. Now, as for the story in Avengers Infinity War, it is incredibly basic. And I said this in my previous Versus video of Infinity War, but the complexities of the movie don't come from the story. They actually come from the villain. But that being said, another aspect to a movie story is the way in which it is structured, paced, and how it handles its tone. Now, tonally, Infinity War is fantastic. It's dark when it needs to be, it's emotional when it needs to be, and it's even nerve-wracking. And even the jokes, for the most part, are incorporated at the perfect times. And with regards to structure, everything is so tight, and there is not even a single scene where I thought the movie was just padding itself out. And as a result, that makes Infinity War have so much rewatch value. I, for one, have seen it so many times I've lost count, and yet, I can still watch it again and again. And even though I can watch Avengers Endgame again, I doubt I will be able to watch it as much as I have seen Infinity War. That's how much Infinity War nailed the structure of its story. So, which movie has the superior story? Well, I'm in a very strange spot right here, because clearly the movie with the superior story is Endgame, but in regards to which one narratively flows better with its pacing and storytelling, that easily goes to Infinity War. The movie gives chunks of the characters time to do their stuff, and then we move on to our next set of characters. And it constantly did this from beginning to end so seamlessly. When Endgame did it, it was good, but it was not as seamless when it switched back and forth between its different set of characters. And the movie's pacing was not as tight either, even to the point where the movie completely stops just to tell us a joke. So as a result, the film with the superior execution of its story is Infinity War. It is by no means the most complex story, but the story it has is told so well and is absolutely flawless, whereas with Endgame, there are several notable flaws that you can easily pick out. Now, our heroes in both of these movies are in two completely different places. In Infinity War, they are going about their lives, fighting off bad guys like any other movie, only they didn't expect that they would lose by the end. And this feeds directly into Endgame, as for the first time, we see our characters emotionally in a place we have never seen them before. And much like Infinity War, Endgame made me invested and feel sentiment towards characters that I originally never cared for. One of those being Nebula. Nebula is a character I never really liked in the Guardians movies. I liked the very dark backstory she was given in Guardians 2, but other than that, I was kind of irritated by her. But of course, leave it to the Russos to take characters I have no care for and make them awesome. Because not only is she great in Infinity War, but she really becomes fully developed in Endgame, and I wholeheartedly welcomed her to the Avengers, something I never thought I would do. And going back to our original heroes, seeing what they do in a world that is massively damaged and that they failed to protect is very interesting. And what makes it even more interesting is that all the characters are dealing with different stages of grief, and they all try to deal with it in their own individual ways. Captain America hosting support groups to try and help people move on from the death of their loved ones was ingenious. This feels very true to what Captain America would do in a world like this. He's still trying to help people as much as he can, despite the fact that he has not even dealt with his own grief. Then we have Fat Thor, and he was hilarious. His weight was played for laughs, but at the same time, looking at him just makes you sad, because you can see that his non-caring attitude, the beer drinking, and his appearance is all a result of depression, and his upbeat personality is all a facade which is masking a lot of pain and regret. So I loved that they did this, and it was legitimately funny for a big chunk of the movie. My only problem, though, is that they stuck with it. And this is not the Thor I wanted to see throughout this entire movie. See, what I thought they were going to do was put him in that broken time machine that Ant-Man was in and make him revert back to his normal physique whilst keeping his mind intact. But they didn't. And as a result, the fat jokes keep on coming, and every time I looked at him, even when more important stuff was going down, at the back of my mind, I was still laughing at his appearance, and I feel like this crippled his ability during the action scenes as well as the emotional scenes. And he didn't look as cool as the rest of the superheroes in the movie, even during that final battle with Thanos. And even during the emotional moments when Thor would break out crying, it felt less like a normal cry and more like a comedic cry. Almost like the movie's trying to find the humor in Thor crying like a wimp. And I felt like they really needed to tone down the jokes with him and allow him to have more of a heartfelt performance, because his emotional scenes were sad, but I could tell that they could have been so much more emotionally hard-hitting than what they ended up being. So I liked Thor in Endgame, but it felt like the humor stayed with him way too much, and they really needed to tone it down. This kind of comedy would work for Thor in his own film, but it really conflicted with the tone of this film. Also, the scenes with Thor and Rocket were nowhere near as good as they were in Infinity War. In Infinity War, it was such an odd pairing putting these two together, but it was actually pretty funny and also quite touching with the exchanges they had. And the two never clicked as well in Endgame as they did in Infinity War. Also, in Endgame, I was expecting a role reversal. Instead of Thor being the depressed one like he was in Infinity War for losing everything, this time Rocket would be the depressed one. And Thor could have even said to him, "Are you sure you're ready for this? What if you fail?" And then Rocket could have said, "Well, if I fail, then what more could I lose?" That would have made perfect sense, as this time all of Rocket's friends are dead, and it would perfectly illustrate that his emotional state has become very similar to Thor's emotional state in Infinity War. And I never got that full emotional impact of seeing Rocket lose his friends. The most we got was this, and this was a genuinely good moment, but I would have liked to see a bit more grief from him. And if they changed up the level of comedy that Thor had with his beer belly, then I think we could have gotten that. And seeing Falcon and Bucky back was awesome. Although having Falcon be the next Captain America, I'm not sure what to think about that. Now don't get me wrong, I like Falcon. As a matter of fact, I was sad when he got dusted away in Infinity War. But to me, Falcon and Bucky are both great companions to Captain America, and without Captain America, I'm not sure what I think about them taking the lead. With regards to stuff I didn't like about the character development, it really only is those things I said about Thor being overweight throughout the whole movie, as it felt like the gag never quite knew when to stop, as well as Banner being Professor Hulk. I thought Hulk was going to have a big comeback after pussing out in the last movie, but he doesn't. We just get Professor Hulk now, and he didn't even fight Thanos in the end. Now granted, I didn't notice that whilst watching the movie, but after you let the film sit for a bit, you start to pick up on these things, and I'm sure they could have found a way to include him in on the fight. And there was this one other thing that kind of bothered me. All the characters kind of retired for 5 years after they realized that they couldn't save everyone. Stark in particular decides to get married to Pepper and start a family, and I was kind of surprised to see that Banner and Black Widow didn't get married or something, given that the previous movies have hinted at a relationship between them. Even the Russos sort of touched on it in Infinity War, but they pretty much act like it was never even a thing in Endgame, which isn't a big complaint or anything, but it did feel a little bit off and inconsistent. And then we have Captain Marvel, and it's time to answer the big question. Was Captain Marvel better in this movie than she was in her own solo film? Well, yes, she was better in here than she was in her solo film, but that doesn't mean she was good. She's a little more loose with regards to her personality, and we actually see one shot where she's practically on the brink of tears when she sees that Nick Fury is dead, but soon after, she pretty much just leaves the movie and doesn't come back until the climax. And the movie was much better off that way, because she really wasn't bringing anything to the film in the first place. And it's sad to see that even the freaking Russo brothers weren't able to get a good performance out of Brie Larson. Everyone else is so much better than her with their performances that she honestly feels like she is from a completely different movie, and a much lesser movie at that. Seriously, Brie Larson, if you are so good in Room, then how are you so forgettable and dull in everything else? And meanwhile, we have Scarlett Johansson here, who is giving the best performance she has ever given as Black Widow. She has several great and emotional scenes throughout the film. The most memorable scene is where she cries her eyes out, and then Captain America walks in and she wipes away her tears, and the two have a conversation. And it was such a genuinely emotional moment, and it just goes to show how much I'm going to miss Black Widow. Black Widow was a great character with a ton of humanity, and she became a better and more sincere person as the films went on, and that culminated perfectly with her sacrifice. Her death scene in here was really sad and so well done. When her and Hawkeye were trying to stop each other from killing themselves, it was also such a great scene and downright devastating to watch. And I can't believe that we now have Captain Marvel taking her place. So other than that, I honestly had no problems with both the heroes in Infinity War and Endgame. So the question is, which movie did a superior job at executing its heroes? Well, I can easily say without a shadow of a doubt that that is Avengers Endgame. Now, I don't hate the characters in Infinity War or anything, I thought they were all terrific, and although they are written better than in their own standalone movies, as their dialogue is written and directed by the Russo brothers, it's nothing necessarily new. They are interacting with each other like they usually do, they're cracking jokes, but they essentially do that in every other movie. In Endgame, however, the characters are constantly in a damaged and emotionally vulnerable state throughout the entire film, and that opened these characters up and made them so much more human and interesting than they already were, and we haven't seen them this broken down before, and I found myself constantly captivated by the emotional journey they went on. So the movie that does a better and all-round more unique job with the characters is Avengers Endgame. I'm just gonna say it, I downright love the action in both of these movies. As I stated earlier, these films are directed by the Russo brothers, and all the movies they have directed in the MCU have had breathtaking action sequences, and they really pulled out all the stops in these final two Avengers movies. In Infinity War, the choreography was amazing, the way more characters would join the fight was great, and characters that you would usually think would be completely useless against Thanos were actually used in ways that were so smart. I was blown away by the sheer creativity that was on display, and you are constantly on the edge of your seat whenever you see Thanos fight our heroes because you know that any one of them can die here. And the final battle in Wakanda where Thanos shows up and our heroes are trying to hold him back long enough so Scarlet Witch can kill Vision was such a sad yet beautifully emotional scene. And the music fit the scene so perfectly. And as for the action in Avengers Endgame, there is actually much less of it. Now don't get me wrong, there is a decent amount of action in this film, but when compared to Infinity War, there is a lot less. But that being said, the action in the first half of the movie was great, and then it ended up being fantastic. Let me tell you, when Captain America picked up that hammer, it was so perfect and it took everyone in the audience by surprise. And it also made this scene in Avengers Age of Ultron have more merit. And I know Marvel were not intending this, but if you look back at this scene now, it can actually be interpreted as a hint that Captain America is actually worthy. And as I usually say, that's the sign of a good sequel, when it makes the previous movie better, as opposed to making the previous movies worse. And I was surprised to see Captain America beat the crap out of Thanos the way he did. He was even using the hammer in combination with his shield, and it was amazingly fast-paced and so creative with his choreography. And then when all the heroes make an absolutely epic return, and all stand behind Captain America and rush into the final battle, it felt like something that was taken right out of a comic book. And not just any comic book, but those comic books where there is complete chaos going on in the panels. The ones where there are so much heroes and powers it looks like a mess, but the Russos were able to visually pull it off where it looked so great. Now visually, it's nothing we haven't seen before. In Aquaman you have an army of different looking sea creatures as well as the evil ones marching into battle, and in Ready Player One you see armies of thousands of different pop cultural characters. But the way this scene was built up and the fact that you are so happy to see all the heroes back right when our last 3 heroes are about to lose the war, it fills you with so much relief and happy feelings that I haven't felt before when watching the movie. And the music that played during the battle was the classic Avengers theme, and it was done so well. There was only one complaint that I had with the battle, and that was that there was a girl power scene where all the female heroes jumped behind Captain Marvel, and it was so forced. So that was the only part of the battle that felt staged, and it stood out like a sore thumb. Now Captain Marvel almost got the last hit on Thanos, but thankfully he took one of the stones into his free hand and knocked her out of the battlefield, and that was a huge relief. Captain Marvel will have several future movies where she can shine, but this battle belongs to the Avengers that we have known for the last 10 years, and the victory shouldn't go to a character that we have known for the last month. This movie would have lost some serious points if it did that, but thankfully it didn't. Instead, Stark snapped his fingers, and that led to a much more emotional and beautiful ending which we wouldn't have had otherwise. I really don't want to choose which movie had the better action, as both films do such an amazing job, and I would watch both of their action scenes over and over again. But although I downright loved the action in Endgame, there was so much more action in Infinity War, and all of it is absolutely perfect, whereas in Endgame, the action is great, but there is less of it. Now I'm not saying that Endgame needed more action, but whereas Infinity War had the quality and the quantity, Endgame has the quality, but it doesn't have the quantity. And not to mention that I found myself more on the edge of my seat with the action in Infinity War, especially when Thanos was involved. And that's why the movie with the superior action is Infinity War. So if you couldn't tell, I really love both of these movies. They tell their stories very well, and on top of that, Endgame raises the stakes from Infinity War. Thanos initially wanted to kill half of all life in the universe, but after the Avengers messed with time to reverse what he did, he now wants to destroy all life in the universe. And that's another thing, I like how both of these movies connect and complement each other. There are several examples of this, but the most important one is when Doctor Strange tells Thanos to spare Stark's life in Infinity War. This turned out to be absolutely imperative, as Tony was the one who was ultimately responsible for killing Thanos and winning the Endgame. So that was built up and paid off extremely well. That doesn't hide the fact, however, that Endgame still suffers from narrative problems, character choices, and tonally misplaced comedy. And in general, the pacing is not as tight as the previous 3 Marvel films the Russos made either. But I watched Avengers Endgame again, and much like what happened when I rewatched Infinity War and Aquaman, my problems with the movie were not as noticeable the second time round, and I enjoyed it far more as a result. Sure, there were some jokes that didn't hit and made me lose my smile, but they didn't make me shake my head like I do when the other Marvel movies tell bad jokes. But the fact remains, Infinity War is a much tighter film, whereas Endgame is a bit of a mess. But that being said, Endgame is much more emotional due to the fact that you can just feel throughout the entire film that this is the end, and is most likely the last we will ever see of these characters. And that ultimately worked to the movie's advantage. It's time for the scores. Just like the last time, Avengers Infinity War gets a 10 out of 10, and Avengers Endgame, I initially gave it a 9 out of 10 because of all the flaws it had, but after I watched the movie again, those flaws were far less intrusive to me, and I was able to enjoy the film a whole lot more. And as a result, my score has gone from a 9 to a 10 out of 10. This was an epic and beautiful send-off for all these beloved characters that we have gotten to know the last dozen years. I was 13 when I saw the first Iron Man, and now, 11 years later, I am almost 24 and I have happily stuck with all these characters after all this time. And Stark's death especially struck a chord for people like me who have been giving him a hard time for all the stuff he has done in the past. But this film was his ultimate redemption, and when I was watching the movie, there was a kid who was briefly crying in our cinema and his parents had to calm him down, and as well as hearing some sniffs from the audience, there was a woman who was actually crying behind us. Surprisingly, the only person who hardly acts upset about his death was his own daughter. So much for I Love You 3000. And the ending for Captain America was perfect. He was finally able to have that dance. And keep in mind, although I gave Endgame a 10, it is a light 10. I still think Infinity War is by far and away the superior movie. So, this marks the end of the original Avengers, and even though I was not very fond of most of their movies for their overly comedic tones, I will forever remember the characters and their arcs throughout these films. And that is in big part thanks to the Russo brothers, who took these characters from their own standalone movies and gave them vulnerabilities and allowed them to reach their full potential. And if it wasn't for them, then the Avengers would not have had such an amazing conclusion to this beloved franchise. So, that's it for my final Avengers Versus video. If you guys liked it, please give this video a thumbs up and don't forget to comment below and tell me what you thought of Avengers Endgame. And do you know what? Seeing as this is my last Avengers Versus video, let's take a very brief look back at all the original Marvel Cinematic Universe films that led up to Endgame. So, let's start with the first 3 Iron Man movies. The first Iron Man is what I refer to as the only classic Marvel movie, and that's mainly because, to this day, it is the best Marvel origin movie, and watching Tony Stark become Iron Man was so engaging, something that the other Marvel movies didn't do very well. I also thought the first Iron Man had a decent villain, but what makes the movie really stand out to me is that it did a fantastic job at giving its title character an arc, and it really sticks with you. Then we got Iron Man 2. Now, Iron Man 2 established some great characters and hinted at several great things to come in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, but it pretty much failed at everything else. The villain was weak, the story was forgettable, and worst of all, this is the first movie where I flat out didn't like Tony Stark. But thankfully, they fixed this in all his future movies. And Iron Man 3, I remember having a lot of fun with this movie. It was by no means a smart film, but it was much better than Iron Man 2, and it made me like Stark again. So that's why I was more forgiving of his faults than a lot of other people. The whole twist with the villain though was just silly, but other than that, I remember having a fun time with this film. And now it's time to talk about Thor. Now, I thought the first Thor film was decent. It introduced me to the character of Thor, and as silly as the movie got when it came to the fish out of water story, I still found myself enjoying it. Both the emotional and comedic moments worked, and when the movie was over, I did want to see another Thor film. Then we got Thor: The Dark World, and this movie was trying way too hard to be entertaining that it just ended up being obnoxious. It had its upsides though. Loki was a lot of fun and a big improvement over the first film. The action was creative in parts, and Thor was still a likable character. The Marvel comedy that I can't stand, however, was the worst here than it has ever been. And then we got Thor Ragnarok, the first great Thor movie. This was a straight up comedy and clearly wasn't meant to be taken seriously, and that was one of its greatest strengths. The movie is just fun from beginning to end, and the visual style is very unique. It comes off as a bit too cheap sometimes, but on the whole, it works very well. It has some really beautiful shots, and the best of all, it has Jeff Goldblum. He is by far the most hilarious character in this movie, and every time he shows up on screen, I can't help but smile or break out laughing. We also have the Hulk show up in this, and both he and Thor have so many great interactions and scenes together. The comedy though did go too far sometimes, and was used when there was literally no need for it. And then there were other times where the joke just flat out missed. And in general, the movie feels like it's rushing from one scene to the other sometimes, and doesn't spend the necessary amount of time with its emotional scenes. And then we have our villain, Hela, and she's a decent villain, but although the movie gives her some depth, I thought she was overly simplistic. But other than that, Thor Ragnarok is the best straight up comedy that Marvel has made, and where the Guardians of the Galaxy films didn't work for me, Thor Ragnarok definitely did. And last but not least, we have my favourite Avenger, Captain America. Now, the first Captain America movie I originally didn't like. I thought it was very slow and looked and felt boring. On top of that, I was so used to seeing Chris Evans play a jokey and immature character from the Fantastic Four that seeing him be so serious and disciplined really put me off, and it just felt so wrong. However, I literally just watched the movie again, and now that we are used to the character of Captain America, I was able to watch the movie and appreciate his origin a whole lot more than I did originally. And throughout the film, you can't help but feel sorry for him all the time. And seeing the friendship between him and Bucky and the relationship between him and Carter really has so much added value now. Whereas the first time I saw it, it just felt like I was watching a couple of random and underdeveloped characters talking to each other. But not anymore. The first Captain America movie really has aged so much better over time, and I was so surprised as to how much I enjoyed it. I was also surprised to find that the tone of the movie was actually quite dark in places too, something Marvel unfortunately doesn't do anymore, and that is a shame. Even the jokes, despite how silly they looked on paper, were presented in a more natural and organic way. Again, something Marvel doesn't do anymore, and that is also a shame. And then we have The Winter Soldier, and this movie to me is damn near perfect. After the first Avengers film, me and my brothers and sisters took bets as to which of the individual Avengers would have the best solo movies, and we all put Captain America in last place because we thought his films would be the most boring. But no, this to me was, and still is, the best Marvel Cinematic Universe film. This film, by all accounts, could have been filler, like Thor 2 and Iron Man 3, but instead, it actually put Captain America in a situation where he realizes the harsh truth, that the country he has been serving all his life is full of corruption and evil, and this movie goes head deep into political corruption, and it was perfect. The action is still among some of the best I've seen in the MCU, and this fight in particular was choreographed by the guys behind the action for John Wick, and it was so fast-paced and had me on the edge of my seat. The movie also makes full use of Nick Fury, and especially Black Widow. A lot of people wanted a standalone Black Widow movie, and I did too, until I saw The Winter Soldier, and then I kind of didn't want one anymore, because she gets so much stuff to do in this film that it simultaneously feels like her standalone film just as much as it does Captain America's. Even she goes through an arc and has to ask herself some very personal questions. So many of these reasons and more is the reason why I think The Winter Soldier is the best movie in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. And after The Winter Soldier, we had the movies which I have already covered, that being Civil War and Infinity War. And don't worry, we will talk about Age of Ultron one day. So, that's pretty much it. It's the end of an era. The original Avengers have more or less retired, and Avengers Endgame was one hell of a high note to end on. And just like them, I'm out of here. Thank you very much as always for watching, guys, and I will see all of you next time. Take care.